I have made many videos regarding this matter, but there are so many things happening from one after the other that it's just way too inconvenient for people to get through all of my videos to know the relevant information. For those of you who are completely out of the loop regarding the mass censorship of anime games happening on the PlayStation Store and Steam, I hope this video can serve as a basic guide on the timeline. This video will contain all of the old information that I've talked about in my previous video to reintroduce it to those who are not aware of this information, but it will also contain new information that you guys might be interested in, so stay tuned. Before we go on even further, I want to say huge thanks to my patrons who supported me on this channel. You can support me through PayPal, Patreon, and finally Subscribestar, which is now fully working if you don't like those too. I also made a new coffee page for those who are interested to support me by buying me a coffee for just $3. You can support me through there as well. Also, very late thanks to my new patrons, Wayne, Jared, and Fantastic. You guys are fantastic. So let's begin. It all started with a game called Omega Labyrinth Z. Omega Labyrinth Z is a pretty simple grid-based dungeon crawler type of game with a very big emphasis on the tits department. It's a game that is pretty shameless on its fan service, and people really like this sort of thing. But Sony clearly didn't, because the game got denied by Sony in the West, even though it was released on the PS4 and PS Vita in Japan. P-Cube stated that the game is cancelled on both platforms in all Western regions permanently. And why is that, you might ask? Apparently the game needs to pass Sony's Q&A, but it didn't pass Sony's Q&A. The thing about the game is that it was already rated M by ESRB and its PEGI equivalent. The game is already prepared for release, but Sony just said, nope, don't do that. Imagine having your game prepped for release, only to be completely denied by the platform owners in question. You can still buy the Japanese version on Play Asia and many other distribution platforms out there, but the game will never see the light of day in the West with proper translations. The banning of that game happened in June last year, and ever since then, Sony decided that banning games wouldn't get them profit, so they just took the compromise of sanitizing the game so that it appeals more to the Western audiences and releasing it in a censored state. One of the most notable games that received a censorship treatment was Senran Kagura Burst Renewal. There's a feature on the game called Intimacy Mode, and that feature is completely gone from the PS4 version of the game as announced by the publisher Xseed. The Steam version, however, completely retains the feature and is even featured up front and center on the Steam store page. Another most notable game from the PS4 censorship policy was a visual novel called Nora, Princess and Stray Cat. It's too long, so let's just call it Nora Neko Heart. Now, the censorship of this game is very notable because it highlights how the PS4 version is very lazily censored to the point where the Nintendo Switch version, you know, the family-friendly console, shows a lot more skin and significantly less censorship than the PS4 version. Ever since then, the convenient god rays are fixed by the characters given actual clothes, which still baffles me in why they have to do this because, again, the Switch version retains the original outfits. Nora Neko Heart is originally a visual novel with quite a lot of sex scenes on a PC, so if the developers want to just focus on the story and want to publish the game in the consoles to a wider audience, they have to tone down the lewd scenes. That's perfectly understandable. What isn't understandable is how far the PS4 version goes on to censor the lewd. The Switch version is fine with some suggestive lewd, but the PS4 clearly isn't. So why does the PS4 version requires more censorship than the Switch version? If people have to choose between the Switch and the PS4 version, they will opt for the Switch version. What this does is to hurt the sales value of the game on the PS4 because the Switch version is clearly superior, at least if you don't count the completely uncensored PC version. Another notable case that needs to be talked about is Silverio Trinity. The game is delayed because Sony hasn't approved the game yet. What's interesting and frankly ridiculous about the entire situation is that the developers have to communicate the release of the game in plain English to Sony because Sony's gaming division has moved to California. This is something that all Japanese game developers had to get through. They have to communicate with Sony in California in order to make sure that their games got released. Considering that the game developer and the publisher are in completely different time zones, I can totally understand why there are complications on the release. There are tons of anime-centric games being changed or modified thanks to Sony's demands, and these aren't even all of them, but those three cases are the most notable ones. Thanks to Sony's gaming division being moved to California, it makes the publishing process more difficult for a lot of game developers developing lewd games. Even to this day, we still don't really know why Sony does all of this. There was that statement from Sony's Japan president, but I refuse to believe that it's a genuine statement. Anyway, we've talked about Sony and the PS4, let's let's talk about Steam. Just when people are beginning to recommend Steam for their go-to website for fan service games, Steam began its crusade to either censor or straight up ban fan service games completely off of their website. The most notable game that got hit with the censor ban was a game called The Key to Home, a mystery visual novel that involves little girls, as poorly translated and advertised by the developers. Now, The Key to Home is banned from Steam many times despite being rated T by the ESRB. I did encounter the artist as loli doujins on Hentai, but this isn't a loli doujin. This is just a game that features little girls. The Key to Home isn't the only game that got banned on Steam. There are many other games that got either banned or delayed indefinitely from Steam, and the reasoning always centered around the games having a school theme or having underage characters. Apparently, games on a school setting or featuring characters that are under 18 years old are not okay by Valve standards, which is weird because If My Heart Had Wings is also being sold on Steam, and you can totally uncensor this game. The game features twin lolis that you can date and have a threesome with later on. So why is this game allowed on Steam and not the other games? Not that If My Heart Had Wings isn't a great game, it's a great visual novel if you apply the translation patch. I'm just trying to make a point here, Valve. Your rules are inconsistent. Valve's main issue here is applying their standards arbitrarily. There are so many games in the Valve store that will break their new anti-school game or anti-loli or underage character standards. But Valve doesn't really care about all of that. Their Steamworks documentation for the developers gives quite a lot of rules in games that are not allowed or published on Steam. But there are games that totally break the rule, like Mortal Kombat, for example. It breaks the rule that a game is not supposed to be designed to shock or disgust viewers. That's literally the point of the Mortal Kombat series. Apparently, this is an old rule. The newer one completely omits that rule alongside hate speech and pornography, which means that porn is totally allowed on Steam. But what isn't allowed is a game that exploits children. Who are the children that you are referring to here, Valve? Are you referring to fictional children? Because there are tons of games on Steam that lets you harm fictional children. Or are you talking about real life children? Because there are tons of games with microtransactions and loot boxes that also exploit real life children on Steam. The inconsistency between their rules and the applications of their rules make Valve to be an incredibly questionable platform to choose if you want to release ecchi games. Now, there are ecchi games that are released successfully on Steam, like the previously mentioned Senran Kagura Burst Renewal, but there are more ecchi games, mostly from indie studios, that are being banned from Steam for reasons that are contradictory to what they've been doing for the past couple of years. So why are the games banned from these platforms? I think we should start off with Sony. While we can't really determine the real reason why Sony decided to either censor or ban these games, we can speculate what probably caused it. I've briefly mentioned how Sony's PlayStation headquarters has moved on to California, and for the record, California is a state that contains quite a lot of moral guardians who want to shove their morality down your throat. Some of these moral guardians might be working on Sony and giving judgments to these Animu games, deciding what's appropriate for the general audience. And yes, all of the PlayStation games need to get through Sony's approval, even if they're not going to be released in the West, which means that for those of you who think that the Japanese version is going to be completely uncensored, well, I don't think that's gonna happen anytime soon. And the thing is, Sony has all of the reasons to move their PlayStation division to California. You might notice that the PS4 titles in general are more successful worldwide, especially in the West, than they are in Japan. And that's mostly because Japan and the Asian gaming market in general has moved on to PC and mobile. They are beginning to abandon the traditional console gaming market because not a lot of people play in consoles anymore here. The consoles are getting more and more expensive, and it becomes a luxury item these days. Why buy the consoles if you can play the games that people play on the smartphones? Another market that is still going strong in Asia is the PC gaming market. The reason is because it's infinitely more convenient and esports is getting more popular. If you're a gamer in Asia and you want to play more demanding titles, the PC is the best place to go. A lot of Japanese game developers are opting to release more demanding games on the PC and even re-releasing old games into the PC because the console market isn't going to last very long, while the PC market is virtually eternal. It's growing more and more in popularity, and it's the go-to option for the enthusiast gamers. Sony moving their PlayStation HQ to California is an understandable move, but that comes in with a lot of baggage. The people working in there are going to be moral guardians who want to make sure that you are protected from those horrifying anime loots. Now, these are all just speculation, but it is a pretty high probability that these moral guardians are making judgments on these games at the PlayStation headquarters. As for Steam, well, they are very openly being moral guardians, a very inconsistent one at that. According to an email that DL site received when they tried to release the game Ayuya Crisis, Steam stated that they will not distribute games that, in their judgment, have prurient representation or exploitation of minors. If your product features this representation, even in a subtle way that could be defined as a gray area, it will be rejected by Steam. And the amazing part from all of this is that Steam recognized about the 18+ defense and how absolutely BS it is. They're not interested to work with partners that dance around the edges of what's legal, like setting your game in a high school but declare the characters 18+. That would instantly make the game to be banned. Now, don't get me wrong, I myself found the 18+ defense to be a load of BS, especially if you blatantly set the game in high school. But if you want to talk about a high school game that exploits minors, let's talk about how you still have Bully Scholarship Edition on your shelf, or If My Heart Had Wings for that matter. Not to dump on these two games, they're absolutely great games that I do recommend, but come on Steam, you can't even apply your rules consistently. And that's the main issue with Steam. At the top of being moral guardians, they're just not really that consistent with their rules, which makes Steam to be a wild card in terms of publishing adult games or ecchi games. There are some games that manage to get away with it, like the aforementioned Senran Kagura Burst Renewal, even with the intimacy mode featured upfront and center, and the characters being underage, but there are also many games out there that are not so lucky. So with all of the mass censorship happening to all of these games, what do you think will happen to all of these platforms that are censoring these games? Well, unfortunately, because these platforms are the biggest gaming distribution platforms in the world, censoring a couple of anime games are not going to hurt their business in a significant way, at least. Unfortunately, the market for the ecchi visual novels and games are relatively small, so even if everyone straight up boycott Steam or PlayStation Store for this, their business isn't going to hurt that much. They will certainly lose customers and people aren't going to buy ecchi games from that platform, but the impact isn't going to be that massive. If you guys really love these ecchi games and visual novels, I'd recommend you to not focus too much on trying to destroy or boycott these platforms. Instead, focus your strength and energy to support the developers who are affected by this through other means. Despite these games being either censored or banned on Steam or PS4, there are many other distribution platforms out there that will sell these games completely uncensored. You can just Google these games yourselves and you will find many other distribution platforms that release these games uncensored. All of the criticisms towards Steam and PS4 are absolutely warranted. All of the boycotts and the outrage are also understandable. However, these two platforms are still doing fine at this moment, with games after games release, and it is still the #1 choice for those who develop something more normal, mainstream, and makes more money. So put all of that outrage aside and focus on what matters the most: the video games and the developers who put all of their hard work into it. You can support these games through whatever means available, and even if you don't have money, just send these developers a word of support and encouragement. Another thing that absolutely helps is to share this information by linking my video or sharing the articles I linked down below to those who are concerned, especially game developers that are making these sorts of games. The more people know what's up, the more people can make a more informed decision on their purchases and their publishing.